And honestly, I've had athletes message me the day or two before comp thinking that they are never going to make weight, that they've tried everything, not realizing that this can be enough to drop as much as half a kilo, sometimes more, without having to eat less or do anything extreme. Even if qualification is on the line, you're still going to need to weigh up the risks versus rewards of cutting. I want to say something a little bit controversial, and that is that most lifters should not be cutting when they are. Welcome to the Unfiltered Athlete, the show where we get real and honest about training, nutrition, performance, and mindset. I'm Georgia Radley, nutritionist, coach, athlete, and now the host of the Unfiltered Athlete podcast. I'm here to help you fuel smarter, train harder, and actually enjoy the process. Join me as I share practical tips, science-backed strategies, and all the things I learned along my journey from starting in the gym as a complete beginner to competing internationally in 2 different sports. First CrossFit and now weightlifting. And with the English Weightlifting Championships happening this weekend, I'm literally competing as this episode is coming out. I thought, what better time to talk about probably everyone's least favourite part of competing in a weight class sport, making weight. This episode is for weightlifters, powerlifters, or anyone who's just curious about weight cuts. And I'm talking specifically about your standard 2-hour weigh-in, by the way, not for 24-hour weigh-ins. And it's also not medical advice, an extreme weight cutting tutorial, or a personalized plan. It is an overview of realistic athlete-first strategies for making weight safely and effectively without tanking your performance on the platform. And these are the same strategies that I've used to make weight for the English and for World Championships earlier this year, which I'll be taking you through one by one, explaining how and why they work and when you should and shouldn't use them. But before we talk about making weight itself, I want to say something a little bit controversial, and that is that most lifters should not be cutting when they are. And most people don't want to hear this, but let me explain, and then it's up to you whether you take my advice on board or not. So I have 2 main criteria for whether or not it's worth cutting. And the first one is this your first competition or one of your first comps? And if it is, do not cut weight. And then the second one is the slightly more controversial one, is qualification on the line? If not, then also probably don't cut weight. And this is advice that I am so glad that I took for my first weightlifting comp, because I actually wanted to compete back then as a 71 kilo lifter. I wanted to qualify for the British Championships, and I was sitting at around 73.5 kilos, I think. And I don't know where I thought I'd lose those extra few kilos from, but if I had tried, I think I would most likely have wrecked my performance and also just been really, really stressed about making weight. And as a result, maybe not even ended up qualifying in that lower category anyway. So I stuck with the weight class that I naturally fell into, and I was able to put all of my energy into fueling well, training hard, and actually being able to feel my best on the platform. And in this case, technically, I was actually trying to qualify for something, the British, but I was still able to qualify in that higher weight class in the end because I fueled to perform well rather than putting all my focus on moving down a weight class and assuming that that would improve my performance somehow. So even if qualification is on the line, you're still going to need to weigh up the risks versus rewards of cutting. I've seen elite international athletes get completely screwed over by trying to fit into a weight class that they've simply outgrown. So this isn't even about whether you are a beginner or an elite athlete. It's about the risks, and that is to your performance and your health, versus the potential, and that is potential, it's not even guaranteed, benefits of competing in a lighter weight class. And I wanted to talk about this topic before diving into the strategies themselves, because if we're really honest about it, and if I look back to that first comp that I did where my instinct was just to cut weight just because, I think 9 times out of 10, the true reason for wanting to cut weight tends to be more to do with our relationships with the scale and body image, and this perception that being leaner and lighter will automatically make us happier, healthier, and even more attractive, which is completely crazy because let me tell you, there is nothing attractive about me when I am hangry and starving, okay? So your performance and your health should always come first. So if you are thinking about cutting because like everyone else is doing it or talking about it, or you assume that you'll rank higher if you drop a weight class, I want you to reflect on that for a second. But I also want you to check your ego, because you honestly might be holding yourself back by constantly trying to cut because you think it looks better to compete in that lower body weight class, or you're actually scared of moving up a weight class, when actually you will have a better day, you'll lift better, enjoy it more if you compete where you land naturally. And then over time, as you grow as a lifter, that is when you might look at committing to a weight class. And it's really important not to shy away and be scared of maintaining or even even gaining weight, because you will be surprised at how much your body can change when you fuel it. Like if you told me in 2023, when I was thinking of cutting to 71, that I'd have abs as a 77 kilo lifter in 2025, I would not have believed you. But here I am, and I'm stronger than ever. And if I tried to stay small and get smaller, I would have stunted my strength and also probably picked up some major injuries as a result of underfueling. So to reiterate, relative beginners and competitions where qualification isn't on the line are two scenarios that I almost always advise away from cutting. And honestly, that pretty much filters out the majority of people who are stressing and making themselves miserable by trying to cut. And so if you are thinking about dropping weight right now, I want you to first ask yourself, is cutting weight truly beneficial for my performance, not just short term, but also long term? Or is it driven by my ego or desire to weigh less and be smaller? Of course, this episode is about making weight, so let's get into how to do it well and without tanking your performance. And there isn't one single method or one best method, but there is a hierarchy of methods from least extreme to most extreme. And when you're making weight, you want to prioritize the least extreme methods and then ideally completely avoid the more extreme methods. And so I'm going to take you through each of these methods in order of least extreme to most extreme. And as we go through, I'll be explaining when, why, and how they should be used, and when they absolutely should not be used. And remember, none of this is personalized guidance. This is for educational purposes only, and it is up to you to put your health and your safety first. So your first line for making weight safely and effectively is not glamorous and it's not fun, and it is the same method as anyone looking to lose weight would use. And that is a calorie deficit, which might seem obvious, but I see a lot of lifters get a lot of things wrong when it comes to deficits. Because when you're looking to maximize performance leading into a competition, any old calorie deficit just won't cut it, if you'll pardon the pun. And messing up your deficit can not only affect you physically, it can massively knock your confidence. So when done correctly, a calorie deficit results in slow, relatively predictable fat loss. And doing it correctly means first, no excessive rapid deficits. You need to balance the speed of weight loss with having enough energy to actually be able to stay fueled for training and recover between sessions. And this will be individual and depend on your current body composition too, but the key is always no extremes. Performance needs to stay at the forefront. Next, your deficit needs to be timed appropriately with your training and competition schedule, which forms a part of something called nutrition periodization, which is so important that I actually ended up adding a bonus module on it inside the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint. And periodization is where we are deliberately planning nutrition in phases, just like you do with focused training blocks, and you'll plan the length and timing of your deficit to match you and your training. So of course, to do this, you need to know how long your deficit needs to last, which will depend on how much weight you're trying to lose. And typically you are going to aim for a rate of losing between 0.2 to 0.5 kilos per week, no more than this, and aim towards the lower end if you are already quite lean. And then once you've approximated that, you are going to time it in relation to your competition dates. And how you time it can absolutely vary between people. If you are leaner, you might actually need to time your deficit a bit closer to competition if starting it too far out from competition means that you would need to maintain a body composition that just isn't healthy or sustainable for you long term. And this is more typical for elite level athletes, but for the majority of people, and if this is not the case for you, or if you actually have a fair amount of body fat that you want to lose for health or aesthetic reasons anyway, then I actually recommend planning your deficit during a training block that is further from competition, especially one that might be higher volume, meaning a higher calorie burn, which can make it that bit easier to stay in a deficit rather than having to create your deficit by eating significantly less. So if it is possible for you to do your deficit, then maintain your body weight just above or around your body weight class in the training block before competition, then this is truly an ideal scenario. You can really use those last few weeks of training to build confidence, lay the finishing touches to your prep, and feel fueled and recovered. Because a huge mistake I see is people doing a deficit all the way up to competition, and especially ramping that deficit up in the last week, doing extra cardio, panicking, eating less and less, and then their final training sessions before competing go to utter shit. And then of course they panic, and even if physiologically they are able to refuel perfectly post weigh-in, which by the way is not likely, but let's say theoretically they have the physical strength to perform, they've fueled well, but their confidence is now shot from messing up their final week of prep, and they're now feeling super nervous, maybe they're struggling to sleep, and they've just created this recipe for disaster. So that extreme last minute deficit can not only impact you physically, it can impact you psychologically too, as the physical impacts then have a knock-on effect on your confidence, especially if you don't have the experience and understanding of what's going on to then be able to handle the mindset things. But let me tell you, even if you do have that experience and understanding, it is still not a perfect scenario. So when it comes to making weight with a calorie deficit, here is what you are not going to do. You are not going to ramp up cardio in the week of your comp, especially not high impact, high power output cardio, which is just going to be adding to your body's fatigue. You are not going to suddenly drop into a huge deficit the week or two before comp because you are panicking about making weight. And you are ideally not going to be in a deficit all the way into competition day. Instead, what you are going to do is firstly, plan any weight loss phase you need to do well ahead of your comp, accounting for how much time you'll need and also your training blocks. If you need to use cardio, you are going to do it sensibly and in line with what your body is already used to and can handle, and you are ideally going to shift to maintenance before your comp. Ideally, at least a week before, so you can really maximize recovery and feel good mentally and physically going into your comp. So that is the basics of using a calorie deficit, and you want to use all of that as much as possible to avoid needing to rely on any of the following methods. But of course, sometimes we do need a little bit more help to get us over the line to make weight, to drop that final kilo without sabotaging performance. And so these next methods are all about getting your weight down for competition temporarily, aka weight manipulation rather than true weight loss. But remember, these methods are only to be done in addition to effective long-term weight management. Not to pull out at the last minute because you couldn't be bothered to do a deficit at the right time, okay? So the first of our short-term weight manipulation strategies is unbelievably simple. And honestly, I've had athletes message me the day or two before comp thinking that they are never going to make weight, that they've tried everything, not realizing that this can be enough to drop as much as half a kilo, sometimes more, without having to eat less or do anything extreme. And that is simply bringing your food and drink consumption earlier in the day, because anything you eat and drink, whether it's nutritious or ultra processed, whether it's high calorie or low calorie, takes time to pass through your body. And so by eating and drinking earlier, you're allowing more time for your body to process it and drop weight from going to the bathroom, sweating, breathing, etc. So if you usually eat dinner at 8 p.m. and carry on drinking, maybe snacking without much thought up until bedtime, you're just going to bring your dinner earlier to say 6 or 7 p.m. And if you know that that is going to make you really hungry when you're trying to sleep, you can have a light snack before bed. And when I say light, I mean literally light, as in something like a rice cake that doesn't weigh much, or even a bit of protein like some chicken breast, but not something high in volume that, even if it's low calories and nutritious, weighs more, like fruit, for example, because that's going to then be in your system, digesting, making you weigh more. And remember, we are looking to manipulate your weight down temporarily. So we want to keep anything that you are taking on board light. And then even more so than food, fluid is a big one, especially if, like me, you are constantly sipping on a bottle or having cups of tea. And so you will cut off your typical fluid intake around dinner time, maybe a little earlier, and then you'll weigh yourself and you'll allocate yourself a set amount of fluid for the rest of the evening, depending on that weigh-in. If you are just over the weight that you need to be, but you know that you tend to drop, say 600 grams overnight usually, then maybe give yourself around 500 milliliters water, that weighs 500 grams, and sip on that so that you stay hydrated, but you are moderating it in line with your current weight. And then of course you'll probably need the toilet at some point in the evening, so you can always weigh yourself again after using the bathroom and readjust your fluid intake depending on what scale weight you've got to play with. And top tip, I strongly recommend keeping a record of what you weigh in the evening before bed and what you weigh in the morning, so that you know in advance how much your weight typically changes overnight, so you can use this when you are figuring out how much fluid or food you can eat in the evening. And also practice this method prior to comp day, so you've got an idea of how much weight you can drop using it. It's safe, you're not slashing calories or dehydrating yourself, so you can afford to practice it without it impacting your training or recovery in your comp prep. The only warning I do have for this one is the possible need to gradually shift your food window forwards if you find yourself really hungry at bedtime, or make sure that you leave some allowance for that small light snack so that you're not struggling to sleep because you're too hungry. The next weight cutting method, possibly the most underused one, and the one that when I speak to athletes, most of them don't even know that it exists, is fiber cutting. I will speak to people who have tried crazy carb and water cuts, but look at me blankly when I ask them about fiber, which is completely the wrong way around because, of course, we want to be using the less extreme methods before we even think about using any of the more extreme methods. And fiber manipulation is far easier, simpler, and safer than carb or water cutting. So as a brief explanation of how it works, fiber is an indigestible form of carbohydrate found in plant foods, things like fruit, veg, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, and it adds bulk, it holds water in your gut, and it slows digestion, which is absolutely essential for health, appetite, and even blood sugar regulation. But it does mean that it literally adds weight in your digestive system. Like, if you consider that if you step onto the scale at any given time, your body weight is made up of lots of different things: your skeleton, your muscles, your hair, your nails. But one of the things that affects how much you weigh on the scale right now is going to be the weight of your digestive contents. And so if I step on the scale, then drink 500 milliliters of water and then step on it again, I'm going to weigh 500 grams heavier, even though my body composition has not changed at all. And so one way to reduce your weight temporarily is to reduce the weight of your digestive contents. And we can do this safely and effectively by dropping your fiber intake in the days leading up to competition. And by the way, this works the other way around too. So if you've ever tried to start eating more healthily and you've added more fruit and veg to your diet and then seen the scale shoot up, this is usually why. It's just because you've got more bulk in your digestive system that hasn't passed through yet. One thing that is really important to note about fiber cutting is that it only works if your fiber intake is already high enough to start with. And we're talking 25 to 30 grams or more. And ideally, you'll know this from tracking your food intake using an app like MyFitnessPal. And then as a typical fiber cut protocol, and again, this is not personalized guidance, different people will respond well to different timings and numbers, but around 3 days before your competition, you'll reduce fiber intake to 10 grams. And then 2 days before, even lower, bringing fiber down to around 5 grams if you can, and then the day before competition, keeping fiber to an absolute minimum. Although, of course, if you end up in weight like 1 or 2 days out, you can consider just keeping fiber around that 10-gram mark rather than dropping it lower if you don't actually need to. But do not make the mistake of thinking, oh, I've made weight, I can just start eating normally again, because as soon as you add that fiber back in, your weight will go straight back up. One warning I want to give you is that apps like MyFitnessPal are extremely patchy with fiber entries. So if you are going to use fiber cuts, or you just want to check your fiber intake is at a healthy level, spend a couple of weeks checking and correcting your usual foods so that you actually know your true baseline before you drop it. And really, the great thing about fiber cuts is that you don't need to drop your actual energy intake. So you're not depleting your glycogen stores, which we spoke a lot about last week, and it's going to have a very minimal, if any, impact on your performance. And as a ballpark figure, fiber cuts can help people drop around 1 to 2% of their body weight, which again can be that last kilo without having to cut carbs or dehydrate yourself or screw up your electrolyte balance. And it also works well for competitive athletes for whom dropping an extra kilo from body fat would actually be detrimental for performance. So they can keep a healthy body composition and drop that last bit of weight just by dropping fiber down a few days before competition. And if all this sounds too good to be true, it kind of is, because fiber cutting is not perfect. High fiber foods are also slow digesting, filling foods. So dropping fiber can mean that you feel really hungry, even if you're not actually in a deficit. And it can also mean that your energy levels are much less stable, because as we discussed last week in the carb episode, complex, high fiber carbs promote a slow, steady release of sugar into your blood. So if you're cutting fiber and needing to rely on more simple carbs, you might find yourself feeling like you're having these highs and lows as your sugar spikes and crashes. And I can tell you from personal experience that I definitely don't feel as good when I fiber cut, but it is still far preferable to an extreme deficit, a carb cut, or dehydration. It is not completely risk-free, it is not easy, so again, your calorie deficit is your first resort, followed by adjusting your meal timings, and only then might you consider messing with fiber if it makes sense for you and your performance goals. Okay, so now we are getting to the more extreme weight manipulation methods. And next up, we are going to talk about carb manipulation. And I talked in the last episode, my deep dive into carbs, about glycogen. It's your body's storage unit for carbohydrates in your muscles and your liver, and it's essential for performance. It's like your body's reserve fuel tank. But for every gram of glycogen you store, you also store several grams of water. So cutting carbs prior to a competition allows you to drop a lot of this intracellular water. That is the water that is stored with that glycogen in your muscles, and in doing so, you will drop weight on the scale. And how much you lose from this will depend on how full your glycogen stores have been. Like if you've been in a calorie deficit anyway, and then you drop carbs even lower, you are not going to see as much of a difference compared to if you had been eating loads of carbs and then reduce them. And then another factor is going to be your total muscle mass, because if you have more muscle, you can store more glycogen and then you'll be able to drop more water when you deplete it. And this can be anywhere from 0.5 to 2 kilos, sometimes maybe even more depending on the athlete, which of course sounds great, but there are some major downsides to carb cutting, especially for 2-hour weigh-ins. Carbs, as you know, are your main fuel source for exercise. And so when you're going into competition, you of course want to be fueled. Now, you don't necessarily need completely full glycogen stores to be able to lift well, but you certainly don't want to be running on empty. And so that post weigh-in period is going to be all about refueling to try and get enough carbs on board. And you might even keep consuming carbs during your warm-up and in between lifts. But this doesn't necessarily negate the effects of having already depleted your fuel reserves. Because firstly, most research points to it taking over 24 hours to fully replenish glycogen. And actually, glycogen is going to be replenished fastest after exercise because your cell's ability to take in carbs is upregulated in this period. But obviously, this is not going to be the case at weigh-in when you're not exercising and you're going to be resting until it's time to warm up. On top of this, a very common problem that lifters run into in the post weigh-in period, and I've made this mistake more times than I care to admit, is digestive issues. Like, I've been so worried about getting enough food on board after weigh-in that I've eaten way more than I could digest in that time, and by the time I've put my belt on for my clean and jerks, it is literally squeezing vomit out of me. So it can be really tricky to get that balance right post weigh-in between getting enough energy intake without overloading your digestive system. And remember, if you've been in a deficit or eating significantly less for a few days before competition, that what is normally a perfectly manageable amount of food for you might not sit as well in your stomach on comp day. So it can be really hard to get right from a fuel point of view as well as a digestion point of view. And another overlooked problem with carb cutting is the effect that it has on you in the days before competition, when you want your body to have the energy to see through your taper week, recover well, and feel on top form for comp day. And depleting your energy by cutting carbs can make you feel sluggish, sore, and weak in those last few days. And especially if you're doing any training, even light weights, just to keep things ticking over and feeling fresh, then feeling weak in these sessions can really knock your confidence, especially if you're not experienced with this. So just like I talked about with wanting to avoid a last-minute extreme deficit, even if you can refuel well post weigh-in, you're also going to need a really strong mindset to be able to deliver a strong performance on the platform. And because of all these potential issues, not to mention the risk of just feeling dizzy, rubbish, and not being able to perform, carb cutting is the penultimate resort. Not quite the last resort, but something I strongly advise against unless you are an experienced athlete, you're being guided through the process, and the potential benefit outweighs the risks. And now it is time to move on to the last resort. And this is where I want to put the biggest disclaimer: do not try this at home. And this is fluid or water manipulation. And there are several ways that we can manipulate fluid separately or together: by water loading / cutting, sodium manipulation, and through sweating. And of all of the methods that I'm talking about today, the following methods are the riskiest for your performance and your health. And I'm not fear-mongering here, but there have been multiple cases of athletes actually dying from using water manipulation to make weight. So I'm going to be explaining the physiology of these methods, like how they work, and I'll be sharing some of my personal experiences, but I cannot stress this enough: do not try these methods. This is for educational purposes, not instructional purposes. And if you do need to make weight with water manipulation, then you should be at a level that you are working with a professional nutritionist who is guiding you through and monitoring you. If you're doing a water cut for a casual tier 3 weightlifting comp or your local meet, then you have messed up earlier in your prep. And I would recommend just competing in the heavier weight class, because ultimately you'll perform better and you'll be more motivated for your next comp to actually plan how you're going to make weight more safely and more effectively. And this isn't about a local or casual comp not being important, by the way. I'm not elitist, and your hard work matters, whether it gets you lifting an empty bar or it gets you to the Olympics. but we do need to be realistic about the risk versus reward. And these fluid manipulation practices might be more common in higher level athletes because they are using them to gain a competitive edge, because that's what's required at the top level to make that sort of extra 1%. But they only get to that level when they've already nailed the basics, with overall managing their body composition year round, nutrition periodization around competition and training blocks, using fiber manipulation, etc. They are already doing the least extreme methods, and if they need to use water manipulation, there is a very good reason, and the risks versus the rewards have been carefully balanced and understood, because a lot of people actually don't realize how risky water manipulation can be. So athletes doing this should be doing it with professional guidance. And so I guess I'm saying, like, you need to go through the process, earn your stripes, so to speak. If you are ever going to be using these methods, don't try to run before you can walk, and don't risk your health for a total, honestly, at any level. So that is my disclaimer. I don't recommend trying these methods, but I want to explain how they work, starting with water loading, which is typically what people are referring to when they talk about doing a water cut. And this is basically where you trick your body into increasing urine output so that you are getting rid of more fluid, and this is how that works. You start off with a very high water intake, drinking a lot more than usual and a lot more than you strictly need. And this is unlikely to be a problem if you know what you're doing under professional guidance, but it is certainly a risk for a beginner who is just winging it after following the protocol that some random guy on Reddit said worked for him. But the idea here is that when you drink all this water, your body responds by increasing urine output to stop you from getting overhydrated and maintain the status quo, aka homeostasis. And so a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, ADH, is suppressed and you pee more. And you might be thinking, but how does this make me lose weight if I'm drinking loads and I'm peeing loads? Well, it's not the water loading phase where you actually drop the weight, it's the next step where you suddenly drop your water intake, and because your body's hormonal response isn't immediate, like it takes time for your body to catch up, there's this period of time where that hormone ADH is still suppressed, so your body is still flushing out water at the same rate. You're peeing more, but you are drinking less, and this is when that temporary drop on the scale happens. In short, you drink loads of water, your body responds by making you urinate more, you reduce your water intake, but you keep urinating at that higher rate, so you lose water weight. Which sounds really easy and really simple, almost too good to be true, and it is, because the problem is that the very mechanisms that you're manipulating with this method, your body's built-in fluid regulation system, are the mechanisms that exist to keep you alive and healthy. So messing with them in any way to manipulate your weight is inherently dangerous. You risk electrolyte imbalances, all the impacts of dehydration that limit performance, like headaches, dizziness, fatigue, weakness, and sleep disruption, and in more serious cases, cramping, seizures, and even death. So let me be clear, this method is reserved for experienced athletes with professional supervision, and even then should be used sparingly and on a case-by-case basis. It's not for your casual local comp, and it is not for cutting last minute because you didn't plan a safe and effective cut in advance. And to make this strategy even more dangerous, some people will combine it with sodium manipulation. And sodium or salt causes water retention. So what people will do is increase salt intake alongside water intake, which affects the hormone aldosterone, which is involved in regulating blood pressure. You know, just another important factor in staying alive and upright, and that is through sodium regulation. So you consume more salt, your body starts getting rid of the salt at a faster rate, and then when you drop your salt intake, you keep flushing it out faster for a short time period, so you're able to lose even more water, as you are also losing salt or sodium that holds water with it. But again, this is even more dangerous and unhelpful for performance than water loading and cutting alone, because you are further upsetting electrolyte imbalance and hydration status. So I really, really strongly recommend against this, which is one of the reasons you'll notice I'm not giving you any numbers or quantities here in terms of amount of water or sodium to be manipulating, because this is something that I do not want you to be doing. It's just something that I want to explain so you can understand how it actually works, and therefore hopefully understand why it's also just not something that you want to be doing if you have any interest in performing well, feeling good, and staying alive, right? That said, I will make an exception for simply reducing salt intake for a day or two before competition without water manipulation and without any specific sodium increase beforehand. So you're just eating and drinking as usual, but not adding extra salt to your food like a day or two before comp. And provided you don't have any specific medical conditions like POTS, for example, that could cause issues with blood pressure, then you will be absolutely fine. And it might help a little with short-term weight reduction because you're going to be retaining a little bit less fluid. But significant sodium restriction, especially if you're doing it alongside water loading and exercising or using saunas and hot baths, which are going to make you sweat, can be extremely dangerous. And just as an example, I actually know an athlete who cramped up during competition because she'd been drinking way too much water and completely cut salt. She was an incredible athlete, but for some reason just didn't have the right nutrition support or education. And luckily, it was just a temporary leg cramp. So the most serious consequence was that she didn't perform as well as she could have. But things can obviously get much more serious than that. And now the last of these water manipulation methods, which arguably can be the most mild because if you're sensible, you can actually monitor it, provided you're not doing it alongside water and sodium cutting, which would be a terrible idea. And that is losing weight through sweating. And this one is relatively simple. You're using heat to increase your sweat rate, and then you're not replacing that fluid loss by drinking more like you usually would if you were sweating more during training, for example. So you are essentially dehydrating yourself. And again, this isn't just about water. You are also losing electrolytes through sweat, which is another risk on top of dehydration, especially if you take it too far. Now, saunas seem to be the most popular option here, but hot baths also work, and personally they're my preference if I have to do this. But when I have used this method, sauna or bathing, it's not been fun and I have deeply regretted it and sworn I would never put myself in that position again. So the first time I tried this, I look back now and I was closely supervised by a nutritionist, so the risk was relatively lower, but with hindsight, I definitely should not have done it. And it was early 2024, I was pushing myself too hard to come back from a wrist injury, because I felt the pressure to perform to be able to stay on the national training squad. And this is just one of those lessons that I had to learn the hard way and a prime example of it just not being at all worth it. So I was going through a lot of emotional stress and my training volume had been lower in recent months because of my injury. So I had struggled to make weight with a deficit like I usually would. My menstrual cycle timing also didn't help. And so we decided to use a sauna to drop the last bit of weight. And some people might have been able to handle it, but I don't do well in the heat at the best of times, and I was just not in a good way. I had saunaed the night before and my brain was not functioning. I remember my boyfriend set up Mario Kart and I was struggling even to play on the slowest setting. I felt awful, I struggled to sleep, and my performance was not disastrous, but it was one of, if not my worst ever total. My wrist hurt, and in every sense possible, the competition and making weight for the competition just had not been worth it. And I swore that I would never make the mistake of being lazy with a weight cut again. But then later that year, I found myself needing to make weight in less than ideal circumstances for the British Championships because they had released the dates for the comp late. And again, I was putting all this pressure on myself to compete to stay on the squad, never giving my wrist a proper chance to improve. But anyway, I had this holiday booked prior to them announcing the dates, a cruise no less, where there is not a huge amount of control over food, and the food that is available is high in salt and training is super limited. So it was a pretty suboptimal situation. But in my head, I had to compete because it's a squad requirement to do the national championships in the right weight class. And this time I ended up using baths instead of a sauna. And I did find that this was far better for me, but still I had to really limit my time and break it up into chunks, because what starts to happen is that your body temperature actually starts getting too high and your heart rate suddenly starts shooting up as your body tries to cool itself down through any way it can. And so you are really running a risk of heat illness. So I learned quickly that I needed to stop at this point, actually stop before I reached that point, get out, cool off, do another short stint and weigh myself in between these stints. And then what I found was that instead of trying to sweat out all the weight while I was actually in the bath where my body temperature was continuing to rise, I was better off putting fluffy winter PJs on, getting into bed, had to put several towels down, and then lying under the duvet and trying to distract myself from the absolutely horrible sensation of dripping in sweat in fluffy Primark pajamas, no less. It was just absolutely horrible, completely drenched. So yeah, I was able to drop over a kilo doing this, But then I ran into the issue of waking up during the night feeling really thirsty and even having this like almost UTI type burning sensation of needing to pee but not being able to. And I'm sorry if this is TMI, but this is the Unfiltered Athlete, and so I am being unfiltered. So I also learned from this that if I did need to do it again, which I really am going to try not to, I would be better off doing a bit less and then waking up in the morning to sweat out a little bit more if I still needed to make a little bit more weight, so that my sleep was less impacted, because bad sleep the night before a competition is a recipe for disaster. Ultimately, that time I did put up a PB total, but only by 1 kilo. Definitely think I would have had more in the tank based on how my training had been going had I not needed to lose water weight. And I got dropped from the squad anyway, and the progress that I'd been making with my wrist rehab took several steps backwards. And once again, it was not worth it. So those are my cautionary tales for you when it comes to using saunas or hot baths to make weight. And hopefully you can learn from my mistakes and what I wish I'd done differently with hindsight to really think hard and weigh up the drawbacks, the cons, and the very real risks of cutting weight with the potential benefits, like the potential benefit of staying on the squad versus the real risk of dehydration, and then I didn't stay on the squad. So that potential benefit never came about, but the risk did. Okay, so that was a bigger episode than I expected. So as always, let's tie everything together so you've got a clear, practical view of everything you need to know about weight cuts. First and foremost, if you are a beginner, if you're not trying to qualify for any major event, or if the cut is coming from a place of body image pressure or ego rather than true performance value, focusing on fueling properly and even filling out the weight class that you naturally fall into will do far more for your long-term strength, your confidence, and enjoyment. But if you are going to drop weight, the backbone of cutting safely and effectively is long-term body weight management, which means deliberately planning nutrition phases throughout the year, which is called nutrition periodization, and timing your calorie deficit effectively for your competition, not using last-minute starvation or excess cardio. And then if you do need to bring weight down a little more, even after an effective deficit, maybe you're fairly lean and it makes more sense to drop a kilo or so, not through a longer deficit, but with some weight manipulation strategies. The most overlooked and underrated in terms of being both super effective, but also having minimal impact on performance are first, adjusting your food and fluid intake to earlier in the day before your competition. And then the next resort is reducing fiber. Next, we talked about carb cutting, which is a strategy that most athletes will want to avoid, or at least use minimally, not completely cutting carbs, because you need energy to recover and feel confident in the final days leading into comp. Plus, of course, you're risking being unable to refuel adequately post weigh-in. And then finally, strategies that involve playing with your body's fluid balance and electrolyte balance should only ever be used by experienced, competitive athletes under professional supervision. And this isn't just about risking your performance, there are serious health risks too. And because we have this hierarchy of methods from least to most risky, the ultimate key to effectively making weight is planning, so that you don't even need to consider trying the more extreme methods. And in doing this, your training and recovery during comp prep and even year round will be better. You'll feel more confident and way less stressed and nervous during your taper week, and you'll actually be able to do yourself proud on the platform. And if this episode has got you thinking about your own weight class, your long-term nutrition strategy, and how you're fueling your performance, here's where you need to go next. Whether you're considering moving a weight class up or down and you want to do it in a way that actually protects your performance, or you want to maintain where you are right now but start eating like an athlete to match your fueling with your training, the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint is for you. I set your personalized calorie and macro targets for you based on my signature testing process. So you're not guessing, and I'm never pulling numbers out of generic calculators that aren't customized to you and your body. You learn how to fuel for strength, muscle gain, fat loss, rest days versus training days, all of it. And there's even an entire bonus module on nutrition periodization to help you map out your long-term plans to match your nutrition phases with your training. There is so much more in there too, and you can discover it via the link in the show notes. And by the way, when you join now, you get lifetime access, so you can actually dive into module 1 whenever you're ready, whether that's today or in the new year. And if you're not actually sure whether it's your nutrition holding you back right now, or maybe your training isn't quite working for you, or you're just feeling a little bit lost with your goals, I've got a completely free tool to help you figure out your next steps and where to focus your attention to get the best results by working smarter, not harder. It's called the Train Assessment. It's my free 2-minute quiz covering 5 key areas essential to your results and giving you a free personalized report with actionable insights to start putting into practice today. Again, that's the Train Assessment. It's free and it is linked in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments what the biggest lesson you took from this episode was, and make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode when I'll be giving you your Christmas holiday training and nutrition survival guide. And if you want to keep learning right now, check out this video where I take you through exactly how to figure out how much you need to eat for your goals based on your body, not generic calculators or ChatGPT. I think you are going to love it. Thank you so much for watching, for being part of the Unfiltered Athlete community, and I can't wait to see you again next week.